The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, my apologies everyone. I have been running late and I appreciate your patience. Could I just check to make sure that I'm being heard? Could you just type in clear in the box there under questions? That would be great, and then we'll get underway. And I apologise again. It was unavoidable, but thank you, Rob. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Mary. Right, obviously I'm coming across. That's good. Okay, thank you for your patience and staying online. I'll just put the video cam on so that we can proceed. Okay, now this is obviously our third topic, and so far we've looked at a number of topics around the characteristics and the different stages of teams. So what I want to look at now is your leadership style and how you can get the best from the teams that you work with. Like all things, if you've got questions or comments, type them in the question box when you think about them, and I'll deal with them at the moment that I see them rather than towards the end. So that would be great, and we've had lots of participation in the past, which is fantastic in regard to that. And of course, you'll receive a copy of the slides and you'll receive a copy of the recording at the end of this presentation. Perhaps not today, but certainly in the next couple of days. All right, moving on. The topics that we have looked at so far is we've looked at the characteristics of high-performing teams. We've looked at the 4 stages of team development, and so these are the foundations, if you like. And now what we want to look at is start to look at the people in teams, and in particular today, look at your leadership style in relation to getting the best from your team members. Obviously, leading a team is a lot more complex than leading an individual or even a group of individuals, because when you've got a team, it's not just the individuals within the team or the tasks that are required, but it's also the maintenance of the team as well. So it becomes an even more complex task leading a team as such. Now, just this slide will come up on your screen very shortly. There it is. And let's just revise what we went through 2 weeks ago. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at the concept of the, this is Bruce Tuckman's team development model, and we were looking basically at the 4 different stages that people go through in a team. And these stages, we pointed out, are totally predictable in the sense that you can identify them at different stages in terms of the maturity of the team. And we also pointed out that what can happen is that a team can regress, so they can go back to a previous stage, assuming certain things are happening or not happening in the team. So there are whole lots of complexities that will really determine where the team is at in terms of its stages. And your homework, of course, was to have a look at your team and to try to analyse at what stage it was at, according to Tuckman's model, and what you might be able to do in order to move or progress it on to the next stage. And of course, if you're in the performing stage, it's about maintaining that performance. So let's have a look at each of these stages again, and maybe you might like to just have a think as we go through these stages where your team is at, and perhaps in terms of your own experience, what you've experienced in teams. So if you've ever been in a team, for example, that's got to the 4th stage of performing, it's a pretty exhilarating experience, but it's not as common as we might like to think, and it does require a lot of groundwork to get it to that point. And that's the reason that, of course, I went through this model with you as a bit of a framework to assist you to move your team on to the next level. So in the forming stage, the team acts as individuals, and there's a lack of clarity around what the purpose and the roles of team members are. So you can probably work out that when a team is formed in the early stages, the important thing for a team leader is to clarify what the mission or what the purpose of the team is and what each individual's role is in that team environment. And when you've got a fairly established team and you've got a new person coming into the team, of course, you've got to go through a little bit of an induction process, not just in terms of what the person does, but also what their role is in that particular team, how they fit in, what your expectations of them are, and so forth. Because if you don't do that, then they kind of get left out, and what happens is other people in the team become frustrated because they make the assumption that that person's probably got more knowledge about what their team role is than they do in fact have themselves. So once we've sharpened and clarified what the team's vision is and where it's going and what people's roles, what normally happens there is you have a little bit of a power struggle that ensues, where various people in the team will test the boundaries, and there's a bit of argy-bargy in the team. So conflict is quite common at this stage, where people begin to establish their place in the team. And when that happens, you get a situation where the team leader, of course, has got to involve themselves in some conflict resolution and basically to assert their authority on the team as such. And this might require conversations with various team members, and it might require some clarity around what roles are. But if a team leader sits back at this stage, what often happens is that the team continues in this conflict mode for a period of time, and of course that's not going to be productive to the team at all. So assuming the leader is quite assertive and is involved in conflict resolution, the next phase is to move on into what's called the norming phase. Now, the norming phase is where there is a level of consensus in the team. So the team is willing to work together. The team meetings become a little bit smoother. There's less argument and more agreement within the team. And there's some clarity around what people's roles are and responsibilities. And that stage is a useful stage because it's the first step or on the way towards becoming a performing team. Now, what the leader needs to do in this case is start to challenge the team, set some high expectations, push the team on to higher performance, and a lot of this would be one-on-one conversations and certainly in team meetings to challenge the team to take the next stage or level of development. And then, of course, if that's done effectively, we move into that performing stage, which is an important stage because that's when the team is performing at its optimal level. Everyone shares in the vision, and people can resolve conflict and issues fairly well. So at this stage, the leader needs to recognize, become a coach and facilitator, and become a kind of almost an arbiter where needed. So the role of the leader, of course, changes as we go through. And what we're going to talk about today is exactly that, is your role as a leader and where you can chop and change your particular style and approach to suit the circumstances you're in and the maturity of the team. So I hope you got some useful ideas from Tuckman. So today I'm going to look essentially at three things, and I want to look at this balance between task and relationship. The reality is that when you're working with a team, you've obviously got a task to achieve or tasks, but there are also relationships that are involved. That's your relationship with your team members and also their relationships with each other and the team's relationship with other stakeholders within and beyond the council boundaries. And of course, local government is a community-based organisation. So the relationship aspect is extremely important, that be managed well, particularly in small councils, and I know some of you come from small councils. The theme of today's session is to be as flexible as you possibly can. So this is about, if plan A doesn't work, try plan B, try plan C, just keep trying and changing and adapting your style and approach so that you can hit the mark at some point. But if you keep banging away doing the same thing over and over again, you'll get the same result. And really, all of this means that you've got to be what they call a situational leader, which means that you've got to try different circumstances and different approaches based on the situation that you're facing at the time. So really, today's session is very much on looking at different situations and when you should try this or when you should try that style of leadership. All right, now before I launch into today's session, I just want to remind you about the stages of learning. And of course, you're in this phase of learning right now, and it's what you can see in front of you is a number of different stages that you go through when you're learning anything, whether it's riding a bike, driving a car, learning to be a more effective leader, whatever it might be. You go through a series of stages, and I just want to share it with you because being aware of these stages can be quite helpful. So as you can see over on the right hand side with these stages, the very first most fundamental stage that people are in a learning environment is what we call unconscious incompetence. Now in plain English, what unconscious incompetence means is I don't know that I don't know. Another a word that describes that is ignorant. So I don't know that I don't know. So you'll find, of course, that people who are new, for example, in a leadership role, probably don't appreciate or realize that there is quite a lot of subtlety and nuance to being a leader, and they think they know, but they don't know. So let's take the analogy of driving a car, because most of us have learned to do that. And in fact, when you go through driving a car, you actually go through these 4 stages of learning. So when you're a teenager, before you get your license, normally you're in the stage of what we call unconscious incompetence. So you think that driving a car is a very simple process. All you've got to do is get behind the wheel, start the engine, and off you go. So most teenagers certainly don't appreciate how difficult it is to learn to drive a car. And I can recall, in my case, getting behind my father's car in the early stages, and I took the car out of brake and put it in reverse, and instead of taking my foot off the brake, which I was unaware, sorry, my foot off the accelerator because I was in reverse, I just sped up the road and fortunately just hit a bush up on the end of the road. I had no clue about the fact that I needed to take my foot off the accelerator at some point because I didn't know. So I was unconsciously incompetent before then. I can certainly realize that after that event, I was actually at a stage, I've gone too far. I was actually at a stage then when I automatically realized when I backed up into this fence that I was consciously incompetent. So now I was aware that I needed to learn certain things, and it wasn't as simple as I probably thought. So that was my first awakening about how difficult it was to drive a car. I realized that perhaps I could learn a few lessons, and perhaps it wasn't quite as simple as I might have thought. And I think we've all experienced that at some point. So it's almost like a wake-up call or a situation that's occurred where we realize that we didn't know as much as we thought we knew. And then, of course, we get to a stage where we're consciously competent. And what that basically means is that we are aware that for example, we have learnt to drive a car, but for the first several months, we have to concentrate and we have to be very aware of what we're doing because it's not an habitual circumstance. So we have to be conscious of being competent. We are competent, but never because we've passed our driving test. But driving a car is not just an automatic process. It's something that we've got to think about carefully. It's something we've got to be conscious about carefully. So if you think about the program that we're running during the Lunch and Learn series for you, a lot of this at your stage is to be consciously competent. So you're trying new things, you're aware of it, it needs to be front of mind, and you need to be very aware of what you're doing. Now, after a while, when you've been doing something for a long period of time, such as driving a car for, say, 20 years, you become what's called unconsciously competent. In other words, you don't need to think too much about it. It's just automatic. It just works. You're driving a car is not difficult. It's a simple case. Really, habits set in. The neural pathways in the brain are developed, and you know what you're doing. So this is where we get to that unconscious competence, where it's just automatic, basically. So that's where we want you to be as a leader, of course, in that stage of unconscious competence. So it's a nice little model, and it's one that you might like to think about as we go through this process of learning. Now, a big theme about what we're running through today is the issue around task and relationship. Now, task is obviously what you have to do in local government. There's a lot of things, of course, that have to be done. There are services and that have to be provided to the ratepayer. And all of those, of course, are the tasks. And those tasks are expected to be adhered to, whether it's, taking away the rubbish or there's a myriad of things that you know better than I do that what local government do. So all of those tasks need to be achieved. But at the same time, of course, as team leaders, we've got a team filled with human beings who basically we have some semblance of a relationship with, and we have to make sure that we are balancing task and relationship. So those people who are simply task oriented often have to work twice as hard to get things done because they don't have any working relationship with the people that they work with. And equally, of course, if you've only got a relationship with the people you work with and you're very relaxed about the task, then nothing actually gets done. And what happens is morale drops off. You need to have both balls in the air. You need to have the task and the relationship working hand in hand. And each of us who are in this broadcast has a natural bias towards task or relationship. Do you know, for example, what your bias is? And is there anything that you can do about that bias? Because really, while there is a weighting towards one or the other, you are not being as effective as a team leader as you might like to think you are. So being too task focused or too relationship focused is problematic. So you actually need, of course, to be able to balance those two. But there's a time and a place where being task focused is absolutely the right thing to do. So for example, in an emergency, then it would be important just to get the job done, right? So you're you're in a cyclone or a bushfire or something of that nature. You just need to get the job done. Relationships are a secondary consideration in those circumstances. But then on the other hand, where relationships are critically important might be where the team morale is low and really you might be the new team leader and you need to build rapport and relationships up with each of your team members and build relationships up within the team. So that would be a case where that's very important to invest time and energy and resources into that. So both of those are very important, and I might get you just to think about that from your own perspective. Now, the balancing act is we have another variable in here. So if you look at the screen here, you can notice that the needs of a team, we've got tasks to be achieved. So the team obviously have to achieve certain tasks. depending on, what your leader of in your organization will dictate the sort of tasks that you need to achieve. But then you've also got two types of relationship needs. You've got the relationship needs around the team, and you've got the relationship needs around the individual. So let's just pull a few things together here on this. I'll just put these up so you can see them. Okay, this will come up on your screen shortly. There we go. So tasks are what you do. The team needs are maintaining harmony, balance, and collaboration. So obviously you want the team functioning effectively. You want the individuals in the team to be working effectively together, and that requires time, effort, energy, and some skill. And then on the other hand, you also want to maintain and cater for the individual needs within the team and their interests and their motivation. So you've now got the relationship part of your team leadership is actually split between team and individual. So you've got to spend time with individuals on the one hand, and you've also got to spend time with the team on the other as a collective. So you can see that the relationship part is, there's two subsets, team and individual. And both of those, of course, need to be working effectively. Now, if one isn't working effectively, that's going to impact on the other. So, for example, if an individual doesn't feel that their needs are being met as an individual, it's highly unlikely that they're going to be operating effectively as a team member, and that's going to affect the team. Or if the team is dysfunctional, and it's likely that the tasks, whatever the tasks are going to suffer as a result. So you have, all of these things are interrelated to some degree. But your job, of course, is to keep all three balls in the air at once. Okay, now I'm going to lead you through a number of different models that will help you just think about this a little bit more deeply. And what I want you to do here is just relax. You don't need to take any notes. You're going to receive these slides and the recording as well. What I'd like you to do is just to absorb some of this and think about your own leadership and how it might be improved based on several models that I'm going to share with you over the next few minutes. So this is the managerial grid. Blake put this together, and the managerial grid has, if you look over here on the left-hand side, you have the concern for people, low and high. So you've got a high concern for people and a low concern for people. And across the bottom is, you could substitute the word production for task, low focus on production, high focus on production. So there are those two variables again, relationship and, of course, task. Just got a question here, so I'll deal with that right now. Ensure working mums are supported with young children at school, e.g. dropping off at school before work. Yeah, thanks, Edward. Yeah, look, it's literally, the relationship part is being mindful that you are working with human beings who have all sorts of needs, and if you're not conscious of those needs, then they're not going to be too conscious about the tasks that you require them to do as the leader. So yeah, being very aware that you are working with a human being who is, in a contractual arrangement where they're doing a job for you, but nevertheless they're human beings. So yeah, exactly. Very good illustration, Edward, of exactly what we're talking about as such. So coming back to the model, you'll notice that we've got task and relationship, and you'll also notice that, gone too far there, come back to it. You'll notice that on the model, if we look at each of the different quadrants, so first of all, let's go here. In this quadrant here, this is low on production and low on concern for people. And this is what we call the impoverished leader. this is a leader who really is shirking the responsibilities of leadership. So a typical example of that might be a lab technician who really is only interested in their own work. They happen to be the supervisor of the lab, and in the lab there might be 5 or 6 other scientists or technicians, and this lab supervisor isn't really interested at all in A, the work that people are doing, or B, the morale or the relationships or the concern for people. So they're basically technical people who are reluctantly in a leadership role. So hopefully you're not in that position. So that's the impoverished leader. So 1-1, meaning low on relationships, low on task. So if we skirt over to here, which is high on task and low on people, then we've got the taskmaster. These are the people who are really just interested in getting the job done no matter what, and they're really not invested at all in the relationship element of the work that they do. Now, these people, of course, can get results fairly quickly, but after a while, of course, the team doesn't appreciate their style or approach because there's no real concern for people. And as a result of that, productivity drops off, and the taskmaster has to work doubly hard in order to get people to comply, to complete the tasks that are required of them. Now, what about the opposite of the taskmaster? We have the country club up here. Now, what's the country club? The country club is high on people and low on task. So I don't belong to a country club. I've never really been interested in belonging to one, frankly, but I would imagine that in a country club, most people are sort of satisfied, not much gets done. People are there to build relationships or network, and there's not many tasks that are actually completed. So the country club leader has a great concern for people, but so much so that they haven't really thought too much. They don't have any demands on people. Their expectations of other people are either non-existent or very low, and people can kind of get away with whatever they want to get away with. And, it's not a bad place to work. Nothing much gets done. Now, you might say, well, surely being high on production and high on people, which is the team management quadrant, would be the best place to go, would be the best place, because this is high on people, high on task. Yes, it is, and generally I would say to you that this is the best place to be if you had to be anywhere in the grid. But there are certain circumstances that, as I said earlier, which will require you to down tools and build relationships. And there'll be other times where it's just important to pick up tools and put relationships on the back burner. And so that's why in the middle of the road leader in the middle here is flexible, because in this position here, they can move into any of the 4 quadrants very, very easily. So they're both task and relationship focused, and depending on the situation, can move fairly quickly and easily into that space. So this is the flexible approach, and that's where we recommend that you be. So that's one way that we can explain this whole notion of the task and relationship. Let's look at a couple of other models. Now, Kurt Lewin, who was around in the early part of the last century, came up with this leadership styles model, and I think it's a great model, and I use it quite a bit because it's simple, but it's also very informative. So what you've got here is 3 different styles of leadership. You've got autocratic leadership, laissez-faire leadership, and democratic leadership. So let's have a look at the autocratic leadership. The autocratic leader is basically telling people to do X. So there's the team there. So the autocratic leader is telling people to do such and such. A classic example of that, of course, is a military officer in a war zone who basically needs to get people to move and act quickly on command. So autocratic leadership in a crisis is certainly a reasonable and it is a good way to go. So the autocratic leadership style is fairly task focused, as you can imagine. The positives of it is that we can get things done quickly. The negatives, of course, are that people will often do it just because it has to be done, but they don't really have any buy-in to what it is that needs to be done. Now, the trick, of course, for you and me is to move between the three depending on the circumstances that we're in. So if we go to the laissez-faire style leader, laissez-faire coming from the French word free and easy, basically laissez-faire leadership is the opposite of autocratic, that is, do X or Y as you see fit. So the laissez-faire leader allows the team ultimately to make the decision of which they will back them and support them in that decision-making process. So an example of that, of course, would be a judge in a court of law. The judge themselves doesn't come up with the verdict about whether somebody's guilty or not guilty. That's the jury's job. The judge's job ultimately is to hand down a sentence as a result and to be informative to the jury on legal matters when needed, and of course to make sure that the courtroom is run in an orderly fashion. So laissez-faire leaders are often leaders who have what we call expert knowledge, and really they can lead on the basis of this knowledge. But what happens is that they are often leading a group of people who have a certain degree of knowledge, and so the leader can allow that team to make decisions on their own without their need. So, for example, in an outdoor working environment, a ganger may not be present at the time, and there might be a leader. There might be a gang or a crew that are out on the road, and they have to make a decision at the time as to whether or not to fill in that pothole or not, because the leader isn't actually there to ask the question. So they have to make that decision, and the leader perhaps might expect that they would make that decision based on their own experience at the time. Now, the democratic style of leader is which is best, X or Y. So the democratic style of leader is talking people and talking through with people to come up with the right decision. So a manager in a professional services firm, for example, wouldn't want to be autocratic too often, and they can't really afford to be laissez-faire. So they actually engage their, say, accountants or lawyers or whatever in a process of discovery about which, of course, is the best way to go. So you've got three different styles of leadership. The advantage of democratic style of leadership is that we're building teams up. Disadvantage is it can take time because obviously, you've got to have a talk fest and you've got to have a meeting and you've got to consider things. So obviously it's fine when you've got time. The advantage of the laissez-faire style of leadership, of course, is that it's giving the team complete autonomy and empowerment to make the decisions that they need to. The disadvantage is that the leader perhaps could be kept out of touch with what's going on the ground, and that can be problematic down the track. And as I mentioned with the autocratic leader, they can make a quick decision, but ultimately the team are probably not as committed to the decision as they would be if it was their own choice. So that's a very simple model that will help you. Autocratics are task-focused, laissez-faire, probably a balance between task and relationship, and democratic again, probably an even balance between people and task. So if you've got any questions or comments or observations, I'll be happy to hear those. Let's move on to the next model. Now, many of you would have seen in your travels, in your reading and some of the courses that you might have done, you've often seen these kinds of tables. What these tables look at is the distinction between being a manager and a leader. And that can be quite insightful, because what we're trying to do, of course, in this program and most leadership programs, is develop leaders rather than managers. Having said that, there is a time and a place in local government to manage. So I don't want to discount what's on the left-hand side of this screen. In fact, what I would be suggesting to you is that you should be developing as a value add some of the characteristics that are on the right-hand side of a leader on top of your managerial capabilities. So let's just have a look at this. I mean, you've seen many of these, I'm sure, and if you haven't, it can be quite interesting, but it's the exact opposite. So a manager administers, whereas a leader innovates. So a leader comes up with something new, whereas a manager makes sure that what's already in place is happening. And of course, in local government, we know that administration is extremely important because you're working in a compliance-driven organisation. But we also know, because we can't continually lift rates and revenue and our sources of revenue, that we've got to become smarter about the way we do business, and we've got to become clever. So in other words, we've got to become more innovative in terms of how we do things. And this is a huge challenge in local government that's traditionally been a very compliance-driven organisation. A manager is a copy, whereas a leader is an original. So a typical leader there'll be something that's unique about them. Might be the way they dress, the way they speak, their manner of speaking or whatever. So there's they're a bit of a one-off, whereas a leader is a bit of a carbon copy and will often model themselves on a previous style of leadership or a leader in another forum. Leaders take risk, sometimes too much. Managers manage those risks without fear or favour. Yeah, well said, Edward. That's true. And of course, in local government, you can only take prudent risks. Because we're working with other people's money. And but nevertheless, a leader's job in that case is to look at where the lines of risk are and to explain that to people and get people to comply to that, which is very, very important. All right, so a leader will focus, will maintain, whereas a leader will develop. So maintaining versus developing, and of course, as you can probably see in this program, this is all about developing people. A manager focuses on the systems and structures, whereas the leader will focus on the people. So there's an interesting difference. So leaders are very much relationship focused, as well as, of course, task focused. Managers will rely on control, and often will be their formal hierarchical position, whereas leaders will inspire trust. So, of course, in this day and age, you can't fall back on just telling people that you're the leader and you want people to do it because I'm in charge. It'll work to a certain extent, but it won't work all the time. Managers have a short range view. In other words, let's just focus on the here and now, whereas the leader has a long range perspective and looking beyond today and tomorrow and beyond that. So they very much look at the vision. Managers ask how and when, whereas the leaders will ask what and why. So they'll ask questions and so forth. The leader has their eye on the bottom line, whereas the leader has their eye on the horizon. All right. Now, of course, there are certain times when having your eye on the bottom line is critically important. So remember, I'm not discounting the things that are on the left-hand side. I'm more or less saying, as a leader, you should be adding things on the right-hand side, but not overemphasizing the things in the managerial column. Leaders accept the status quo, and the manager accepts the status quo, whereas the leader challenges the status quo. So there's always, why are we doing it this way? Is there a better way? Is there a more useful approach? than what we've been currently doing, which becomes really, really important as such. All right, now the leader will, the manager does things right and the leader does the right thing is a nice, neat change there. So you can see the importance and value of some of those leadership traits in teams. And what I'm encouraging you to do today is pretty much value adding some of the things that are on the left-hand side with the right-hand side. So, being provocative, questioning things, challenging why people are doing things the way they are. If people have said to you, we've always done it this way, then say to them, does that mean we've always got to do it that way? Just don't let things off the hook. Always question why people have their point of view. Why did you say that? What did you mean by that? Can you explain that to me a little bit more, please? All of those things become critically important. So there's an interesting distinction between managers and leaders, and local government has traditionally fostered managers rather than leaders, and now, because of the tight budgetary constraints that we're under, we need now to start to foster leadership, and we need to do that because we can't just keep doing the same things over and over again and expect to get different results. Okay, now one of the ways that you might like to think about your leadership is with the continuum of leadership styles. So what that means is that over here on the left-hand side, you've got the use of authority of the leader. So you can see it's quite high. Over here on the right-hand side, you've got an area of freedom for the followers, which in this case is quite high. So as you move from the left to the right, your leadership style is changing significantly. And what I'm strongly suggesting that you do as a leader in a team situation is to try to use all of these approaches. And you'll notice that across the bottom, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We've got 5 different approaches. So you should be using them all. And in fact, the proof of the pudding is this, that if I came to your local government environment and I was introduced to 6 people, let's say, that knew you really well, and I showed them this model and I said, here's the model, where would you place your boss? Can you tell me whether they tell, sell, consult, share, or delegate? Now, the answer that you don't want is, oh, he sells or she shares. Because what that means is that they've typecast you into a particular style of leader. Now, whilst that might be great in certain circumstances, it's not going to be great in all circumstances. The actual answer that I want your team to tell me is, it depends. Sometimes they're this and sometimes they're that. It really depends on the circumstances and the situation that they're in. That's the answer that I want, which will imply that you're very flexible in terms of the way you deal with certain situations. So let's have a look at these 5 different situations and consider them, and consider some cases where you might use this effectively. So over here on the left-hand side, you have a high authority as the leader. The leader announces that what is to be done. So as I mentioned earlier, in a crisis where you need people to make quick decisions, this telling style is perfectly valid. And not only is it perfectly valid, interestingly enough, your team would expect you to be that in those circumstances, as long as, of course, you're not like that all the time. So in a crisis, they will expect you to take control, they'll expect you to direct traffic, and they'll expect you to continue to do things in a certain way. On a lesser scale, let's think about your team meetings. Let's say that somebody in your team has been taking a long-winded answer to a question, and it's now 10 o'clock, and your meetings always traditionally finish at 10 o'clock. So you're sitting there and you're thinking to yourself, my boss really should say something here because this person's just dominating the meeting and it's 10 o'clock and I've got to be somewhere else. So it'd be perfectly valid for you as the leader to say to that person, look, I'm more than happy to hear your explanation for this, but I'm just letting everyone know that it's 10 o'clock and basically that means that we're finishing our meeting. We've agreed to finish on time and we'll do that. So I'm actually just setting down the tone and saying that's the way it is. I'm not being disrespectful to them, but I'm certainly not being disrespectful to the rest of the team who basically know that it is a 9 o'clock finish and they need to move on to the next thing. So that's perfectly valid. Moving across the scale a bit more, it can be useful to give an explanation for your decision as well. In other words, the selling of the decision. So if you said to somebody, look, we need to take on this customer relationship management system because we have no choice. The fact of the matter is we've had umpteen complaints over a long period of time with the old system and we really need to upgrade it. And I don't want to be put in a position where I'm managing a whole bunch of complaints because we've got a faulty system. So we've decided to adopt the new system because of that. All right, so I'm still telling, but more than telling, I'm also selling why we're doing it. Now, the next two can be very, very confused because they look the same, but they're not. Now, the consulting phase is where I consult with other people, but ultimately what happens is that I end up making the decision, right? So I decide what to do and but I'm still going to be prepared to talk to people. Sharing, on the other hand, it means that we're collectively going to make a decision. All right, so what that means is that I want the team to make that decision. And delegation, of course, is where I allow that team to make the decision and let me know what they come up with. All right, so you can see that you can move across that continuum quite easily, and I strongly recommend that you do that. All right, finally, we get to the end of the session, and I just wanted to come back to Blanchard's situational leadership, which is one of the most reputable models that are out there. And what Blanchard is basically saying is this, that you need to take into consideration the maturity of your team. So you'll notice down the bottom here, we've got high competence, high commitment. So they've split it up into high competence means that I've had a lot of experience and I'm quite skilled at what I'm doing. High commitment means I'm very motivated in what I'm doing. All right, so obviously D4 is ideal. Now, in a D4 environment, of course, delegation is ideal because you've got competent people and you just need to direct traffic. And that's very, very helpful when you've got that. But of course, not all of you have got the luxury of that. On the other end of the continuum, we have D1, which is low competence and a high commitment. So, yep, these people are pretty excited about what they're doing, but at the end of the day, they don't know what they don't know. So they're at that unconscious incompetence. So they might be young people who're just starting out in their career in local government. I need to direct them. I need to be very clear. I need to be autocratic with them as such. But what about people who have a low commitment and low competence? Coaching, of course, hands-on, day by day, moment by moment, situation by situation. And what about supporting? Well, this is where you may come up against people who have moderate to high competence and their commitment is varied. So it's being in the right place at the right time and helping people to direct traffic as such. So I hope that I've given you some clues as to how you might lead. And as you could probably guess what your homework is, it's going to be, there's two messages out of today's session that is really important. One, is to be flexible in your leadership approach. All right, so it basically means this. If plan A is not working, we need to adopt a plan B. So be prepared to change. So if I'm trying to be autocratic and I find that it's getting nowhere, then don't just keep banging on with that. Try another approach, okay? Because it may well be that you're using the wrong approach, and that could well be the reason why you're not getting the response that you want. So try and vary your approach and style. And be prepared to be flexible, as in, if plan A doesn't work, I move on to plan B, and if plan B doesn't work, I move on to plan C. And essentially, that's the key message out of all of this. Not to be too rigid in your leadership style with the team. Because remember, the key message out of today is to balance the task of people with the relationships that you have to work with. And if you balance both of those up effectively, it's likely that you're going to be a very effective team leader. So guys, have you got any questions at the last minute before comments, observations? More than happy to take them on board. While you're thinking about that, here's your homework. We always have homework, of course, and I want you to simply take and consider one of the tools you've learned today, and I want you to go and apply it for a day. I want you to consciously go out of here and start to apply one of those tools. Now, some of those, I threw a lot of things at you today, and you might say, well, I didn't like that one, but I can see the benefit in that. Go through the slides, pick something that you like. I would suggest that you copy it out, plaster it on your wall or somewhere where you're going to see it every day. And I want you just for a day to practice doing whatever it is that you do, whether it's varying your style from autocratic to laissez-faire to democratic. And I just want to actually, for the day, to actually do that. And then I'd like you to reflect on it. So how effective have you been? And reflect on that. So that's your homework. And then when we come back in 2 weeks' time, we'll move on to the next topic, which of course is the roles that people play in teams. So the trick now for you is to just apply what you've learned. So if there are, there is another question. Let me deal with that before we close it out. All right, no, it's just a message of thanks, Tim. Great reminder to keep going and changing it up when we need to. Thanks, Kerry. That's kind of you to pass that feedback. So yeah, it's exactly what it is, Kerry. You couldn't have said it better. So guys, thank you. I look forward to seeing you in a number of weeks, and I would say to you that thank you. I've enjoyed working with you, and I wish you all the best. And by all means, of course, you can send, anything to me via email that you think might be useful for me to know about your own journey in leadership. So thanks, guys. I wish you all the very best. Thank you and goodbye.